The next section of this lecture is to look at the provincial planning documents. These documents, the structure for these are created under the Planning Act, and we're going to look at two specific examples of a provincial scale plan. So again, the idea behind these plans is that we are creating that consistency for the 400 plus municipalities because there may be multiple natural features that we are trying to ensure are consistently managed. So the two examples that we're going to be looking at are the Greenbelt Plan and Places to Grow. And you'll see as part of the lecture slide, what I've included is that there are provincial pieces of legislation that guide the development of these two planning documents or guidance documents. We're going to specifically look at the plan as part of this lecture. So I'm going to start with the Greenbelt Plan. You can access the PDF from the link in the lecture slide. The Greenbelt Plan was most recently updated in 2017, and the plan is meant to be protective. The key feature that it's looking at is the Niagara Escarpment and the Oak Ridges Moraine. And so you can see those two features on the map that I've included here. The darker green area that runs all the way up to the Bruce Peninsula is the Niagara Escarpment. And then the Oak Ridges Moraine is this kind of more army green color that runs across this central part of Ontario. And so when you think about these features, two components, these are rapidly growing areas in terms of population growth. So both are part of that greater Golden Horseshoe area. So huge development that's happening as we move out of the Toronto area and as we move in both the northern and southwestern directions. When you look at these areas, some key natural features that are also included in here. So Oak Ridges Moraine, when you think about the Oak Ridges Moraine, on the surface, we see large tracts of forest. When you think beneath the surface, there are aquifers that are invaluable for servicing our communities' water needs. When you think of the Niagara Escarpment region, this region really moderates the temperature within Ontario. Also large tracts of lands and interconnectedness between those different areas running all the way up to that Lake Huron from Lake Ontario. And when you think about the types of activities that happen within the Niagara region because of the way that that feature moderates our temperature, we have a lot of specialty agricultural areas that happen within the Niagara region. So longer growing times, more moderated temperature means we can grow things like tender fruit, so lots of peaches and nectarines and grapes. So we have a huge new wine industry that has been established based on that temperature. And so when you think about the Greenbelt Plan, what I want you to think about from a land development perspective, the idea is that we are trying to create balance across those multiple municipalities within the greater Golden Horseshoe area and identify where urbanization should not happen in order to be more protective of agricultural lands that may be sensitive to that development and recognizing that those are also unique features within Ontario. And then to think about some of the ecological features and the functions that those provide. So those long tracts of forest provide habitat space, but they are also providing us some ecosystem services that clean our air and filter our water and provide us with different products. So that is the central purpose of the Greenbelt Plan. When you look at the map, you can recognize the number of municipalities that this plan is trying to support and ensure some coordination. As we read the plan, you'll see that we have then, based on the need to protect these features and manage growth, there is specific terminology and language used within the plan. So the first one is looking at a protected countryside. Okay, and it's looking at those two key features is agriculture and natural systems as areas of provincial interest that we are trying to be protective of. When you think about the development side, we're then looking at classifying that development into specific areas. And so you'll see those settlement areas defined as towns and villages or hamlets. And there's very specific guidance on how those specific features can be, or those specific areas, I should say, can be developed. Okay, and so as you read the document, make sure you're taking those two considerations. So protected country lands, countryside, again, is looking at where do we have those existing lands. So we do already have some legislation and some provincial plans that help to guide that. So that's including the Niagara Escarpment Plan, and we have a whole separate commission, a planning body who helps support that. And then we also have the Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Plan. So it's looking at joining those two features and recognizing that there is interaction between the natural spaces within those features. Okay, so protected countryside lands, again, the two key features. We're looking at agriculturally as well as environmentally, and making sure that we protect those linkages because we understand that they help to support wildlife and natural spaces, the habitat that are included in there, and then more protection of our watershed and the water features within those watersheds. So we are going to have a look at the Greenbelt Plan. Again, either you've already opened up the PDF document, or you can use the link that's included here. And I want us to go in and have a review of section 3.4. And here it's going to establish the types of development that can happen in these different development areas. So you're going to see some language around hamlets. And so the other category of development is towns and villages. So we're categorizing the types of communities we have in these particular areas. And then, so I want you to look at how can we develop differently in these two areas, hamlets versus towns and villages, and what sorts of development activities are permitted within each. Okay, so have a look at section 34. I'd suggest you pause the video and we can have a bit of a discussion about what sorts of development may be happening in these two areas. So once you're into the Greenbelt Plan, you have gone to section 3.4. Really want you to have a look specifically at the language about these two categories that they're talking about, towns and villages and hamlets. And pay attention as you're answering the questions to looking at things like the size of these different areas or different municipalities. So towns and villages and their sizes are very different than what hamlets are. I also want you to look at the servicing that is included for each of these. And so when I talk about servicing, think about how towns and villages, the individuals who live there, how do they get their water and waste, how is their wastewater dealt with, versus how hamlets and their water and wastewater may be different. Okay, and so as you look at that, what I'm hoping that you see is that towns and villages are often larger. All right, and when we think about servicing towns and villages, normally you have municipal services that are provided. When you think about hamlets, those hamlets are smaller, and often when we are looking at that, they have on-site sewage and water services. So think private well, private septic system that is servicing those communities. And so when you look at the direction that is provided for towns and villages versus hamlets, what we're looking at is trying to, wherever possible, development can be directed into those towns and villages, and we should be looking at hamlets as not locations in which growth we want to happen. And that's partly because as those hamlets grow, it means we may need to be providing other services. Once you put municipal infrastructure in, we see populations explode. All right, so normally those on-site sewage and water services mean that it's much easier to restrict growth. And so where we have hamlets, we are directing development away from those areas. So that last slide gives you some details on the thought process within the Greenbelt Plan. We've talked about being protective of certain areas, looking at agriculture and looking at some of our key natural features, and looking at the types of development we currently have, towns and villages versus hamlets, and trying to ensure that growth is happening in the appropriate areas. On this next slide, what I wanted to show you is a section looking at some of the additional policies to help support that. So I'd like you to have a look at section 3.4.5. And if you just want to pause the video as you review that, I want you to think about what is the context that we're using within this specific section of the planning document. So I have as a first question here, what's the name do we give to these types of policies? And have a look specifically at what it's saying within subsection 2 of that section. So the nomenclature is terrible here, but it's 3.4.5.2. All right, and have a look at some of the wording there and see if you can explain that in your own words. So hopefully you've had an opportunity to look at that particular section. What I wanted you to notice in here, when you look at section 3.4.5, what it's talking about here, the language is where a municipality has already initiated expansion prior to the date of the plan, it can be exercising some differences based on the direction that we just spoke about. And so what this particular section is called a transition policy. So it is suggesting that where a development may have already been approved through the municipal planning process, we recognize that activities don't suddenly halt on the day that this particular plan came into effect. And so it's giving developers and municipalities an opportunity to transition into what the next steps would be for any future development proposals. So as you read through these sections, it's giving some ideas on making sure that we also recognize some of those sensitive features, but allowing municipalities the flexibility to slowly move into the requirements of what this plan is saying. When you look at that longer section, so we're giving some transition policies, you're seeing that in that last section, subsection 2, it's saying that ability to be flexible does not apply in certain areas. And so you can see that they're very specific on certain locations. And so what I wanted to do is show you on the next slide, as you read that specific section, all right, that it's talking about some specific areas that may be excluded from that ability transition. All right, and so you will see in the image I'm about to show that many of these areas are areas that are already high growth and that they include some very sensitive features. All right, and so I'm just showing you that last subsection B. It talks about an area, it talks about 16th Avenue and this York-Durham line and Steeles Avenue. And what I want you to notice is this creek running through this particular area. So I believe this is the Rouge River. All right, and so you can think about where that particular tributary runs. If you can see based on the green shaded areas that we have a very long track of green space. And so the Greenbelt Plan, although it is giving some exceptions to say, okay, we will allow this to be phased in, it's recognizing that there are some really significant features that are already there that we want to make sure that we are protective of. So in those particular cases, if there was development that had been already approved but not started within these areas, it did give the ability of the municipalities to halt those activities the day that the plan came in, so that we are more protective of these particular areas. So kind of an interesting mix of restrictiveness versus being a little bit more flexible in some of the requirements that are going on. Okay, so that was the Greenbelt Plan. I also have my second example is Places to Grow, and this particular plan came out around the same time as the Greenbelt Plan, and it's called Places to Grow, and you can access the PDF through this link. Again, relatively new updates to this document, so it's not new. It wasn't just produced in 2019, but we have had some modifications and updates to the document since it first came in. It is also a provincial plan, some guidance to a collection of municipalities in order to be more protective of certain features. But this particular plan is all focused on development. Okay, and so the purpose of this plan is to help support decisions about growth, to help support some consistencies on how we maintain a robust economy, looking at that objective in the provincial policy statements about a strong community and a healthy environment, and how that we can work as collective communities to create a culture of conservation. So how do we best manage our natural resources? What you'll see within this document, they talk about complete communities. So as we are looking more focused on development, whether it's subdivisions, industries, services like shopping malls, that as we develop those communities, a complete community means that we are meeting multiple needs of people. So your houses are close to your work, and your houses are close to healthy, active living spaces. So people don't need to travel outside of their communities as much to be able to access those services. Part of what this plan does, so focused on development, it's looking at prioritizing intensification. So where we already have development, where can we undertake some infilling? So if we have empty lots, rather than continuing to create urban sprawl, we want to focus development in on those empty lots that are already within a developed area. When we talk about complete communities as well, we're not looking at just single types of housing, that we want to create multiple types of housing, because that also creates affordable housing. So we don't all want, 3,000 square feet houses in every development. We want the opportunity for some smaller homes that are friendly on our budget. So we provide those multiple opportunities. The other component in here is the environmental component. And so you can see, although it's focused on development, it's making sure that there's that balance with natural features. And it's taking into consideration the changes that we are seeing as a result of climate change, and how might that impact some of our planning components, and how do we need to be managing growth and sprawl and some of the pollutions that come as a result of that, in order to address some of those climate change considerations. So I think that can include a need to commute from where we're living to where we're working within our communities or beyond. It can look at flooding. It can look at access to natural areas, because we know that there are huge ecosystem services that our forests and our wetlands provide and help to clean the air and water that we breathe and drink. So it's taking into all of those pieces as we continue to develop. I wanted to show you, if you open up that document, part of this is starting to focus where development can happen. So we know that some communities are highly developed, and we know some communities could still stand some of that intensification and infilling. So I wanted to show you what some of those current statistics are. And you can see here, this one specifically focused on our region, looking at Simcoe County and all of the municipalities within that region, and creating some very specific targets on both population. So we will have new residential opportunities, but also additional employment opportunities. So it's not just houses that are going in to these municipalities, but we're also looking for commercial and industrial opportunities that create that employment target. And so if you compare these numbers to City of Barrie's current population, you can see the potential that we have to grow within our communities. The other piece that works into when we look at both the population and employment is when you look at section 2.2.3, these numbers are generated based on a specific density of residents and jobs. All right, so the provincial planning document doesn't have necessarily this table. This table is included as a schedule later on, but those population densities were created for a number of different areas based on that particular section. So if you have a look in that a place to grow document, the PDF, and you're having a look at section 2.2.3, it's speaking about these areas where we want to focus that growth. And so the language that they're using is urban growth centers. And as you look, it includes those minimum density targets, and that there are certain areas. So when we look at high growth centers, so City of Toronto is classified as one of those. The density is 400 residents per jobs. City of Barrie falls into this last category, so we are a lower category, but we are saying that these are areas where we can focus some additional density, and so that additional density, we are working towards 150 residents and jobs per hectare. Okay, so a way that we can be incorporating policies, again, the idea here is that we are creating some consistency within multiple municipalities within a geographical jurisdiction, and trying to think collectively about best practices on how we can move forward with development within those areas. Oops, sorry, I skipped it. Okay, and so again, part of the direction to municipalities is level of intensification, but it's also looking at some direction that as you develop, there's some things that we should be taking into consideration. And so a great example from our perspectives as environmental managers is looking at stormwater management. This links back into the climate change scenario where we're having more flooding, and how can municipalities do better at how they are planning for those severe weather events. So it's making some suggestions, some general guidance to municipalities that they must be developing some stormwater master plans. How are we going to be implementing stormwater management? How are we going to be continuing to maintain the systems that we do develop? There is some very specific guidance in there about ensuring that it works back up to the watershed level. So if you think about the provincial policy statements, it's suggesting that we plan from that perspective and that we are protective of water quality and quantity. So it's matching those expectations of the provincial policy statements. It's also including some additional new direction based on some new infrastructure best practices and technologies. So this is the first time, so this updated document, we're now seeing language around low impact development and the appropriateness of using that rather than traditional stormwater ponds, and thinking about existing green infrastructure. So when you hear that term green infrastructure, what I want you to think about is that we are talking about trees and wetlands and those sorts of things that may already exist that help to support better infiltration of water. So if we're maintaining those, then we may not need to construct some of those stormwater management man-made infrastructure. The other component in here is looking at full life cycle costing. So historically, municipalities may have identified the need to ensure that we are capturing stormwater, but the costs and the efforts required to maintain that infrastructure hadn't been incorporated as part of the plan. And so now the guidance document is very specifically asking municipalities to incorporate that as part of their planning process. I'll also show here, so linking back to when we think about the provincial policy statement, this document is reiterating the need to think about some of those provincial interests. So again, you can see some consistency in the direction to municipalities about ensuring that we are protective of some of these key features. So you should see the consistency and similarities in what we looked at in the provincial policy statement document. Okay, so in order to get into some other details and get you guys to interpret a little bit more, I want you to have a look at page 40 and 41. And here is in that growth plan, it's talking about some of our natural heritage systems. And as you review that section, I want to see if you can just pull out one example of how the plan helps to manage growth in order to be more protective of this of natural heritage systems. So if you pause the video for a second, do that review, have a look at section 4.2.2 and see some of the minimum standards or guidance that this provincial plan is providing to municipalities on how they can do that. How can they continue to grow while also being protective of natural heritage systems? So once you've done that pause, I'll have you take a look at that specific section. And if you look at subsection 3, so you should be on page 41, and it's giving some specific guidance to municipalities on if as we're creating new subdivisions or commercial or industrial spaces, that there are some minimum components that we can be incorporating. So for example, at least 30% of the total developed area will remain or be returned to natural self-sustaining vegetation. And so we're thinking about some of the natural ability of our environment to address things like water and provide habitat. And so if municipalities are being consistent, that it helps to support that we are sustaining those specific natural features and functions. Okay, so again, the point of the growth plan is, yes, we are allowing development, but it's trying to provide some guidance and consistency with all of those municipalities. So you can also have a look so the document provides those similar recommendations looking at key hydrological features as well. And so if you look at the next section of pages, you can have a look and give one example on some of the guidance that we're providing municipalities on looking at those hydrological features. So if you want to pause the video, you can have a read through those, and then I'll show you some of those examples. So let's look at some of those examples together. So if you have a look on page 44 of that Places to a Place to Grow document, again, the idea here is this is the provincial government setting some of those consistent suggestions. And so what you will see here are all examples on looking at what are our key features in terms of provincial interests that we want to be protective of, and what are some of the guidance or general minimum standards that each municipality can be including. So if you look at, for example, this one, we can look at for key hydrological features, fish habitat, significant woodlands, so no less than 30 meters measured from the outside boundary of that feature to wherever that particular development may be. All right, so again, think that these are setting some desired outcomes like we talked about in the provincial policy statements. And then it's up to each of the municipalities to look within their own jurisdictions to think about how they can then be implementing these particular plans. And so if you remember from the beginning of this section, it's looking at municipalities are conforming to, or at least not creating some inconsistencies with the overall intent of what these policies are suggesting. So the last little bit that I wanted to show you as part of this lecture is just the desired outcomes of what this particular, the places to grow planning document is looking at. So what you're seeing on this slide is if we continued with business as usual, so the green areas are areas that are those natural greenbelt areas that we are trying to be protective of. Any of the purple areas are looking at areas that are already developed, and the orange areas are looking at how we would continue to develop if we didn't take these policies into consideration. So watch, and I'll flip back and forth between these slides, that as we move from this business as usual scenario to a scenario where we're actually implementing these more restrictive development policies, the level of development that can be decreased, or the level of sprawl that can be decreased. And the outcome of this means that we are being more protective of the environment and those natural features and some of the ecosystem features that they are providing to other organisms, or some of the eco functions that they are providing services to us. So when you look at the areas that are saved, part of the projections of this plan, it's saying that we are saving approximately 800 squared kilometers of natural spaces. And if you need something to visualize, think about it's approximately 100,000 soccer fields that we are able to preserve if we follow these particular plans. Okay, so I have one last question for you. We've looked at two examples of provincial plans here, and the idea behind the two separate provincial plans is that we are trying to create some direction. So my last question to you is, how does Places to Grow, this last document that we looked at, how does it complement the Greenbelt Plan? So I'm going to ask you to pause and just think about that for a bit, and you can include your answer in the slide here. And then when you unpause, we'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, so you've been thinking about how Places to Grow, the last planning document that we looked at, complements the Greenbelt Plan. And I want you to think about it in two ways. So one, think that the Places to Grow document is looking at directing development to existing urban areas. Okay, so it does talk about that where expansion outside of these areas, it gives some directions on how that might happen. So think about the discussion on some of the requirements for municipalities to have setbacks and that sort of thing. All right. But it also complements some of the environmental policies that we saw in the environment plan. So remember that it's looking at the same general area. So we're still looking at the Oak Ridges Moraine area and the Niagara Escarpment, and looking to direct development away from those significant features so that we protect some of that network and natural system, and being mindful of some of those natural resources that we are trying to conserve. So some of the groundwater resources, or ensuring that we are being more protective of the agricultural areas. All right, so while they are two separate documents, they are complementary. Greenbelt Plan is protective of those natural spaces. The Places to Grow is directing development, but there is interconnectedness in the significant features and areas that we are trying to manage within both of those documents. So the question always is, why have two separate documents then? Which is a great question. You would have seen on the slides that it is the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing who has developed both of those documents. And so just to wrap up this particular segment, I wanted to show you that there has been a coordinated effort to do a review of multiple documents. So you'll see in this listing, it does have that Places to Grow, the growth plan. It's got the Greenbelt Plan that we just talked about, and it is inclusive of the two plans that guide development in the Oak Ridges Moraine and Niagara Escarpment Plan. And so in 2015, that coordinated review of all of those documents happened, which resulted in the two documents that we just reviewed today. All right, and so if you are interested, you can have a look, think about some of the public consultation requirements. So these were all posted as on the Environmental Bill of Rights registry. And what you're seeing, the listing of town hall meetings, is that opportunity for in-person public consultation in multiple areas as well, to show that they did look for stakeholder input and feedback from communities on some of the suggestions that they were making in these documents. I also wanted to show you about some of the visuals that they provided people. So when we're talking about intensification and the types of density and growth that we wanted to see based on the growth plan, these are some of the visuals that they provided to those community members. If you recall, Barrie was in this particular density, so we want 150 people and jobs within a combined acre. All right, and so when you're thinking about what that looks like versus what the density requirements for Toronto are, the community looks very different. All right, and so a great opportunity to actually show individuals how that may change their specific community. Okay, so we are ending the provincial plan segment of the lecture. There's one more video that you can watch that will help you understand the slides on the municipal scale planning. So don't forget to watch that one.